"We are the last hope for the world," said the man. "We are free." A pronouncement set in the context of signs reminding us that Jesus saves, and it is in God that we trust. That was an image of the Epiphany last year. I apologize now for being expedient. You know, I am sure, that properly speaking, this great feast is celebrated on January 6th. I recognised that our numbers would be low this morning, but I suspect that at the 12:10 on Thursday they will be even lower, and so I exercised my right, as it were, to move Epiphany back to today, Sunday, January the 2nd. But on January the 6th, last year, the man said, "We are the last hope for the world. We are free." One of many similar statements that came out on that day, which for a generation or two, certainly of residents in the United States, if not around the world, will be remembered for something more politically pertinent than the Epiphany. On BBC Radio this morning, in its weekly roundup of things of interest to people of religious faith, there was an interview with Professor Andrew Whitehead, who is a professor of sociology in Indianapolis and the co-author of a book called Taking America Back to God. He was being interviewed in advance of the anniversary of the insurrection which so dominated the news this time last year. He was being interviewed about Christian nationalism, which he thinks plays a very major part in the phenomenon that led to the insurrection. And he speaks, at least this morning he spoke, of it being a particular type of Christianity privileged in the public sphere that basically benefits its leaders. And in print he's expounded this a little further. At its heart, he says, Christian nationalism fights to preserve a particular kind of social order, an order in which everyone, Christians and non-Christians, native-born and immigrants, whites and minorities, men and women, recognize their proper place in society. Such a very particular form of Christianity, which Professor Whitehead was at some pains to stress, is hard to correlate with what you might call orthodox historic Christianity. Such a form of Christianity, if it even deserves that label at all, he sees as being one of the key factors in the political unrest witnessed almost a year ago. Of this gospel I have become a servant. That may be the case for the person who proclaimed that they were the last hope for the world. Is it, I wonder, the gospel for which you or I hope, have become servants? Is it the gospel for which the author of our first reading became a servant? Ironically, in one of those bits of juxtaposition which must be pleasing for journalists, ironically, the next sector of the BBC programme about religion moved, of course, from Washington, D.C. to South Africa. A young woman, Alila Biela, who is a youth worker in the Anglican Church in South Africa, speaking about the man who had inspired her and so many other countless millions of Christians across the world, commented that the Church should not be silent on matters which suppress humanity. A rather different approach from recognizing that everyone should be in their so-called proper place in society. And in the same news story, the current Archbishop of South Africa, Thabo Magoba, was asked how he wanted, in a sense, to use the moment of Archbishop Tutu's funeral, how he wanted to use this for the benefit of the mission of the Church. He said, and I quote, that we should use this opportunity to turn a new page. Let us commit ourselves, he said, to the radical and revolutionary change that Tutu advocated based on the demands of the Bible, loving each other as if we were God in Jesus Christ to each other, being intolerant of corruption, being intolerant of suffering, being intolerant of those who demean others, but being so loving in pointing them to the right spiritual path, the right moral path that ensures that all of us live abundantly, he said, evoking Jesus' famous words from John 10, I came that they may have life in all its abundance. That Archbishop Tutu should die and be buried in such close proximity to the events of January the 6th last year, to the anniversary of them, is an extraordinary irony perhaps, and one that should open our eyes to what this great feast that with ecclesiastical expedience we keep this Sunday, the feast of the Epiphany. Because the Epiphany is about making things plain, making things manifest. And the role that it plays in Matthew's Gospel is to help underscore the fact that in Jesus becoming manifest as a king of some kind, even to these strange beings from distant lands practicing a different religion, what's really being made manifest is the universal, inclusive, and unstoppable love of God, which it seems to me truly is the first and also the last hope of the world, and brings us closer, I think, to what the author of the first reading meant when he said, of this gospel I have become a servant. The trouble is, we look at a figure like Desmond Tutu and we step back in awe. He was a truly extraordinary man, the man who could put, in a sense, the religious dimension to what Nelson Mandela achieved in the political sphere of South Africa. A man known across the world, and despite being of diminutive height, stood taller than almost any of his contemporaries. How can we aspire to that? The poor current Archbishop of South Africa was asked jokingly if he wanted to apply for the job in the radio interview, and he said, good heavens no, I am not what Desmond was. And we probably all feel that. We aren't figures of that kind of enormous clarity, enormous prophetic gift, and enormous love. How can we aspire to what Tutu stood for? But what we are reminded in today's feast, what we're reminded from those two scripture readings is actually we can be magi. We can even, I want to suggest, be Paul, provided we are prepared to pay the price. Because certainly some interpretations of the story of the wise men bring out the costliness of what they did, not just in their offering of precious gifts, but the whole expedition. Building on the great 17th century divine Lancelot Andrewes, T.S. Eliot, in a famous poem, talked about how difficult the journey was for these people. Hostile cities, unfriendly towns, villages, dirty and charging high prices, say the Magi in Eliot's imagined words. Voices singing in our ears, saying that all this was folly. Well, I guess Archbishop Tutu could have related to that. He certainly knew about hostile cities and unfriendly towns when, in September 1986, he was enthroned as the Archbishop of South Africa. He moved, as was his ecclesiastical right, into Bishop's Court, the residence of the Archbishops of Cape Town, in a white-only part of the city. He lived there illegally. He chose not even to seek the particular permission that he might have been granted by the South African government, because he knew that the church should not be silent on matters which suppress humanity. That was a hostile city, but a city which he and others peacefully helped change for the better. And as I say, even if we can't be Tutu ourselves, we can aspire to being wise men. We can aspire perhaps even to being Paul. Eliot's poem continues, "We returned to our places, these kingdoms from which they had come. We returned, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods," say the Magi. They recognize things have to change. We are even told, of course, by Matthew that they go home by another route. Things have to change. And that's down not just to great leaders like Archbishop Tutu, it is down to all of us, because the definition of a leader is that they have people who follow them. And that's down to us and the choices that we get to make. Are we at ease with the current dispensation? What kind of change do we want to work for? We saw the fruits of one interpretation of Christianity playing its part in working for a change that I suspect those of you gathered here this morning are concerned about. A movement which I do not believe has gone away. It will be interesting to see what, if anything, happens in 4 days' time on the anniversary of the insurrection. These, I want to suggest, are alien people clutching their gods. They are not the kind of people, I would suggest, that we choose to follow. We don't know much about these strange figures, the Magi. We don't even know how many of them there were or what gender they were. The word in Greek is a masculine noun in the plural. There was more than one of them, and they left 3 gifts behind. More than that, we really don't know. They are, in one sense, anonymous. And when we look in the mirror and think, how can we be a Desmond Tutu-like figure? The answer is we don't necessarily have to be. There is room for those of us who are that little bit more anonymous, but know who we are called to follow and what gospel is the gospel to which we become servants. And even so-called Saint Paul, from whom we heard in that first reading, I need to tell you that not everything read from that lectern is necessarily historically and factually true. And if you ask the vast majority of New Testament scholars working in seminaries and universities, the vast majority of them will tell you that they do not believe Paul himself wrote the letter to the Ephesians. It's a fascinating, powerful, beautiful document in its way, but it is probably not authentic Paul, quite possibly written after Paul himself had been martyred. It's a strange document because we don't really know who wrote it, although we know it was somebody who aspired to the values that they saw in the Apostle Paul, much as we might also aspire to the values we saw in Archbishop Tutu. We don't even know to whom the letter was really addressed. We call it the letter to the Ephesians, but some of the earliest manuscripts discovered don't have those words in the opening title. And there are certainly some theories that think it was a circular letter to all sorts of Christians gathered in all sorts of churches towards the end of the first Christian century. It's a letter by Christians to Christians, and that's all that matters. And it reminds us that we have to work out of which gospel we become servants. But what we do know is that we have to be ready to make the sacrifice that goes with that. The Magi, in offering those gifts, I think we might assume we understand them offering up the symbols of the old ways, the tricks of their trade that are no longer required, having discovered the nature of the Prince of Peace, the nature of the universal love of God that will be manifested in Jesus the Christ. Let us love each other, said Archbishop Magoba, as if we were God in Jesus Christ to each other. Wouldn't 2022 be the most astonishing of years if everyone worldwide who set foot in a church this year lived out that wish, uttered in honour of Desmond Tutu, uttered rather more in honour of Jesus, whom the Gentiles came to worship? I tell you something, of that gospel, I would be prepared to become a servant. Amen.